Welcome to Mandates and Megaphones, hosted by Jeremy Maggs, unpacking the politics, promises and power plays behind the G20 summit.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Mandates and Megaphones, brought to you by Standard Bank. I'm Jeremy Maggs, and I don't need to tell you that in just a few days South Africa hosts world leaders for the G20 summit here in Johannesburg. But before the spotlight shifts to global politics, we're looking at one of the more practical tests as far as the presidency is concerned, and that's food security. Agriculture has been at the heart of the G20 working group meetings chaired by South Africa. These sessions promising action on new export markets, climate-smart farming, small farmer inclusion. But as the summit approaches, I think South Africans want to know what's been delivered, what is still talk, and how can agriculture become a true engine of jobs, trust and growth. And my guest in that respect is our Minister of Agriculture, John Steenhuisen. John, so as we head into the G20 summit, maybe let's start with this. What did South Africa actually secure from these working group meetings?
Well, I think what we were able to secure was the adoption of what are called the Ubuntu high-level principles on food security. And I think what they're going to do is what they have done is build on the legacy that Brazil set in their G20 presidency on highlighting food security and the importance of food security and its contribution to both well-being and national security, and will then establish them going forward now into the next stage of the G20, which would be the handover and, of course, the assumption of the United States of America of the working group's work on food security.
The declaration sounded ambitious, but if I'm a farmer, what concrete action am I going to see?
Well, I think what you're going to see very, very clear is that there's now a policy framework for South Africa aligning the National Food and Nutrition Security Plan with the global and regional instruments that are available. I think there's very clear work now to try and stabilize food prices and improve affordability, but also if you're a farmer, looking at a great deal of certainty, particularly around regulations and standards for international commodity markets and trading and standards for export. At the moment, we're seeing Europe having a set of requirements in terms of residue figures, packaging, etc. What we're trying to do is look at way of harmonizing those around the world to make it easier, but then also to open up more markets for agricultural goods, particularly from Africa into established markets in Europe, the United States, and of course the new markets that are opening in China and the ASEAN region.
So let's talk about that word harmonizing. What does that mean and how do you start doing that? And in terms of the new export markets, which countries and which products are at the top of the agenda here?
Well, it's global, so it's within the G20 countries, but we're obviously hoping that given the initiative the G20 has, that these would then also start contributing to global standards. So we've got the draft export standard regulations, which streamline certification of products, but also the traceability requirements. And this is particularly important, as I've said, in our engagements with the European Union, and then also to ensure that global instruments around trade are not used to bully or protect local industries, but are actually genuinely focused on being able to ensure good quality products for consumers and that consumers are getting products that are traceable. You would know, Jeremy, of course, the long-standing dispute we've had with the European Union on citrus, particularly. They insist that citrus black spot and false codling moth are an issue for them. We've proven beyond doubt that these concerns are unfounded, and yet these barriers to access to the European market remain. It's our view, of course, that these are being used to obviously protect some of the European countries, especially Spain, to protect their particular markets. And so if we're going to have harmonization and fairness in trade, we've got to make sure that the standards are known to everybody and applied to everybody, so that whether you're a South African farmer or a Nigerian farmer or a Kenyan farmer, you're able to have the same access to markets around the world.
Minister, take us inside the room if you can. I'm led to believe that talks with the United States, which I think is understandable, and also Argentina were difficult. What caused that friction and how is that overcome? Because they are two important players here.
Yeah, well, I think, Jeremy, the friction arose at the beginning of the G20 with what they call DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which they regard as a problem, and then particularly in the food working group and the agriculture working group, a kickback against climate change, and it made it very difficult because there's just simply any time something mentioned climate change, for instance, in the food group, what are the strategies to ensure greater food security in particularly developing countries, is a focus on indigenous crops and breeding, using new breeding techniques to breed climate resilient crops that would make it easier for them to adapt to changing weather patterns. And there's just been a kickback on that. And then, of course, big initiatives to include women and youth in agriculture. And that unfortunately also fell victim to some of the DEI narrative that those two countries had taken a very strong line against. But I think overwhelmingly the other countries have all agreed these are important issues, these are important interventions, and that realistically these are the things we need to be doing if we're going to ensure food security both locally and globally.
But if there's not a broad consensus on climate change, for instance, that is immediately going to put all players on the back foot, isn't it?
Absolutely, and that has been one of the main challenges with the US particularly. And as we've moved to roll out Climate Smart Agricultural Technology Fund, the CSATF, which we've piloted in Limpopo and KwaZulu-Natal to finance irrigation, solar cold chains and moisture sensors, finalize the National Soil Health Framework, which was done with the Agricultural Chief Scientists meeting, and of course then to integrate pest and disease modeling from our biosecurity hunt into climate adaptation planning. That has all been quite a difficult conversation to have, which has led to a layer of complexity in this year's G20 that I still think you're seeing playing out now with the decision by the US not to attend the summit.
So how difficult is it going to be then, Minister, to get any kind of real commitment or partnership to move the ball forward in this respect?
Well, as I said, there's broad consensus and deep consensus amongst all of the other countries. South Africa will form part of the troika of the G20 next year, the present, the past, and the future. So we believe that we'll be able to use our position as one of the troika countries to ensure that even during next year's G20, these issues that we've raised remain as part of the conversation and discussion going forward. It's going to be very interesting to see how America approaches the G20 next year and what initiatives they choose to highlight. We suspect it'll have a big focus on the economy and economic growth and development. But I think there are important legs to the economy, particularly the challenges facing the world, that will need to be discussed, that I think there's not an appetite to discuss in the US G20. But using our position in the Troika, we hope to make sure that these issues do remain on the front foot, because food security is so intrinsically linked to national security, particularly in the African context, but also in other parts of the globe where you have food insecurity. It generally leads to social unrest and an unraveling of the national security. So these are important issues that have an impact globally, but also locally.
Let me bring it back to South Africa if I can. And no secret here that our ports and logistics, Minister, do remain a weak link. Against the broader global backdrop that we've just been talking about, how soon can you realistically, or can, not you personally, but how realistically will it be to fix the cold chain and export bottlenecks? Because unless we get that right, again, we remain, to use that trope again, on the back foot, don't we?
You're absolutely correct. And there's two aspects to this. I'll deal with the first one, which is ports. And South Africa's ports languish in the lower 300s of the world efficiency. And the model that we use currently, which is a state-owned model, has been abandoned by many economies around the world, including some that one would consider more state-led. And the move internationally has been towards private-public partnerships, and we've seen that both on our continent but internationally. I think that we've seen an initiative and an improvement in the port efficiency this year, and Minister Creasy's done some really good work in improving it, but it can be a lot better. The citrus and deciduous fruit sectors have told me quite openly in meetings that they could, in the medium term, quadruple or more local production provided they had ports. I think the win of the court case now in Durban is going to allow us to proceed with these public-private partnerships. It's the path that Minister Creasy has outlined. But there's a second aspect, Jeremy, that's going to be very important for us to consider, and that is inter-African trade. And their logistics are a major concern. It was very disturbing to learn during the course of this G20 period that it's cheaper for the World Food Programme to import maize from Mexico into the DRC than it is to get from African countries like Zambia and South Africa. And so we need to look very carefully at our own intercontinental logistics, because if we're going to have the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, it doesn't mean much if we can't move goods and services efficiently and effectively around the continent. And that's why the corridor development currently happening around the Lobito corridor is going to have to be replicated many times over on the continent to make it easier for us to move goods and services as seamlessly, efficiently, and effectively as possible, so that we can start to really take advantage of intra-Africa trade as well.
So how effectively then a role can Africa play in shaping that new global food systems framework that you're talking about? And maybe more importantly, how can this country position itself as a real continental voice, if not a leader in that discussion?
Well, Jimmy, I think that Africa has really got a huge opportunity when it comes to food production, and I suspect that we will become, in the next 2 decades, the food basket of the world. Why do I say that? Rich soils, no shortage of land, and of course a large population of workers. I think that we have the potential to position Africa as the food producer in a global context. Where does South Africa fit in that? Well, we are the most advanced economy on the continent. We are also the most advanced agriculturally when it comes to things like mechanization, precision farming. And it's going to be us using our expertise through instruments like the African Agricultural Development Plan, CADAP, adopted by the African Union in January this year, to start to intensify and ensure we're using lands properly, we're preserving soils, and that we're upping production through the use of technology, so that we will be able to have the scale and the product offering that will be required by the rest of the world. And I think that we have a huge opportunity here as South Africa to be the continental leader in the agri-space. But there is huge potential for the rest of Africa to get a look in. As it's becoming more and more expensive to produce food in established markets, Europe and places like the UK have a very heavily subsidized agricultural sector. Our sector in South Africa is not subsidized at all. It is cheaper and more efficient to produce food in Africa. And I think if we can get some of these trade barriers down and have genuine access to those markets, we can lower the cost of food for other countries, but at the same time boost agricultural exports from our country, but also the continent.
But how difficult then is it to use the G20 to advance those issues that you're talking about, tech transfer? I think you referenced precision farming, seed technology, data systems, all well and good. It could lift productivity for emerging farmers, but there's huge risk attached to that. How do you start getting that flywheel moving more quickly?
Well, I think it's about getting access to the markets, first of all. If the markets open up and the opportunities open up, it then stimulates the production here. But we are still quite far behind in terms of tech on many parts of the countries on the continent. There's still a large portion of farming being done in the African context is subsistence farming. And we need to move towards intensive and scaled commercial production that can come through a variety of ways. Tanzania and other countries are aggregating smallholder farmers into bigger groups that then are able to plant at scale to meet the export quotas and requirements. It will be difficult. Agriculture is very emotional, as you've seen scenes in France and other parts of Europe where farmers regularly bring city centres to a halt. They drive tractors to the centre because it's a very emotional situation. But the reality is that if we can produce food cheaper, it just makes sense to give Africa fair access to markets that we can lower the price of food for consumers. And food price inflation is becoming a big issue. In the US, a large part of the reason I believe that the latest executive order from the White House lowering and removing the tariffs on things like citrus, coffee, tea, and other agricultural products is because of the upward pressure it's using to drive pressure on food price inflation. And I think there's been a recognition now that be able to bring good agricultural products at a good price from places like Africa actually helps you keep your food prices down in your own market. So I think that given the food price pressure that many governments are facing from their consumers, I think you're going to start to see a more pragmatic approach, hopefully, as we proceed.
Well, let's talk about that pragmatic approach, because there's no doubt that food inflation is hurting consumers the world over. Minister, what in your opinion then is the single biggest lever that governments could pull to ease food prices sustainably? Probably a lot more complex than just one solution, though.
Well, I think the one thing would be to have market harmonization, to make it easier and fairer for people to have access to those markets. Closed markets genuinely drive up the internal prices in countries. Let's look at sugar, for instance. The sugar beet industry in Europe is very heavily subsidized in order to keep those farmers as a constituency on board. It's not cost effective, though, and it drives up the cost of those products, whereas we are able to produce sugar at a very low price in countries like South Africa, India, other countries in South America. But those markets remain closed to us because there's protectionism. I think if we were able to drop some of the protectionism and allow us to rather trade than rely on aid, I think it would be better for the developing world to have those fairer access to those markets.
Let me pivot the conversation slightly. There is a perception from some global investors that Africa lacks, and I quote, bankable projects as far as the agri-sector is concerned. Is there a plan to change that perception?
Yes, and it lies in changing the way in which land is utilized and the way in which we promote farming. One of the big things, if you're wanting to have bankable projects, is to have scale. That's not possible if you've got thousands of people involved in subsistence farming. They're planting just enough to keep themselves or their village or community fed. And if we're wanting bankable projects, we've got to offer scale. And that has to come from aggregation of land, aggregation of producers, away from uneconomical units and into units that are scalable and saleable around the world. One of the projects we've embarked upon in South Africa, for instance, is tying up producers with markets and using the scale by bringing smallholder farmers together to produce commodities that are then required by the market. Unilever has partnered with the department and with those small-scale growers. They guarantee an uptake of chilies and a variety of herbs they use for their dried food products. They benefit from having local production and local access. The smallholders now benefit because they are working together to provide the scale and quality. And the model works a lot better. So it all comes down to scale in agriculture. And that's why we need to move away from small subsistence plots into real commercial entities that are then able to go out and bring in the revenue that's required to then provide sustainable livelihoods.
Providing those small-scale farmers are not just engulfed by large agribusiness. How do you find the sweet spot?
Well, I think that the best way to do it is the model that we're using, where you have the guaranteed uptakes. And there's a variety of examples about how it's happening around South Africa already. For instance, South African breweries stimulates a huge number of small-scale growers in the barley sector. They require barley for their malting processes. They provide the guaranteed uptake, which gives those farmers then the ability to be able to be sure that they've got an uptake for their crop and that they won't be buffeted by or exploited by international prices and international markets. So I think that those are the models that we would want to look for. Of course, also then by ensuring there's proper corporate governance and proper oversight over the projects, makes it prevents the exploitation aspect that we've seen. I also think the other opportunity is for Africa to be looking at far more processing of agricultural goods. We export avocados and then re-import guacamole from many countries. And there's those examples repeated time and time again. I think there's huge opportunity in terms of the bankability to be looking at agro-processing. How do we do value adds on our agricultural products? How do we make macadamia butter and macadamia oil rather than just exporting tons and tons of unshelled macadamia nuts around the world? And I think that's where you start to see the value add and the job add in that as well, provided you are able to do so at a price that can compete internationally.
Minister, let me bring you back to the oversight question that you've just raised. Corruption and inefficiency, again, in this country, notably, but also in many other parts of Africa, have dogged agricultural projects. I think that's fair to say. How does one rebuild credibility and delivery to make sure that the process is honest, transparent, and smooth?
Well, I think it's done project by project, and we are changing the model and the way in which we fund projects going forward, because you're right, there's been a lot of corruption, a lot of insider-outsider issues, and a lot of wastage. Agricultural products where dairies, for instance, are set up in areas completely unsuitable for dairies. I think it lies in making sure that at national level we're able to exercise oversight, and we're moving towards a system of quarterly drawdowns against performance rather than just providing a lump sum at the beginning of the year towards a project, that there would be a quarterly drawdown measured against targets on that project to ensure that we're creating the viability, sustainability and profitability that is required to then ensure those projects are not just ways for people to extract large amounts of money and walk away, but become genuine agricultural production points, and where we're producing produce that's then providing an income and ensuring the sustainability of those projects.
So as the G20 kicks off then this week, maybe we should start ending this conversation by a view on how South Africans need to understand the stakes for the country at this time of global economic tension, rising protectionism and divisions, as we've discussed, on climate and trade. How should we be focusing on the next week?
Well, I think it's a very important time for South Africa and Africa. It's the first time the G20's ever come to the continent. And so what it does do is give us an opportunity to put the South African stamp, but also the African stamp on this G20, and to ensure that Africa and our issues remain on the table of the G20 going forward. I think it really is a time for all of us to be putting our best foot forward to make sure that our visitors are hosted properly, and that despite the fact that we've seen a boycott from countries like the US, we're able to get some genuine workable outcomes from this, and that people leave with a sense that South Africa really is a country that is on the up, that we are turning the corner from an economic perspective. We're serious now about the reforms we wish to take, and we're also serious about our role as a global player in terms of the African agenda. And I think those are very important points to get out over this next week. And that, lastly, that we open for business. There's huge opportunities, and I think that the silver lining of the tariff debacle with the United States has forced us to get off our laurels and go and start looking for other markets and knocking on doors that we've not knocked on before. And I think that it gives us a huge opportunity as well to have bilaterals with many of those countries, perhaps where we've not been. We've been lulled into complacency because we have access to the US and other markets. That goes and gives us an opportunity to go knock on those doors and open up some opportunities there.
But of course, it all comes down to that final communique, if in fact one is produced. What should we look for then as a sign that the summit has delivered substance and not just symbolism?
Well, given the US's boycott, it's unlikely that we will get a declaration. It's probably more likely to be a chairman's statement, as we saw in some of the other G20s. But I think to look there very clearly at measuring the success about how we've been able to get Africa and South Africa's issues that we find important on the agenda, how we deal with debt costs, how we deal with agri-food systems, how we deal with food security. And I think those in the final statement, I think, are going to be very clear indicators about what we've been able to achieve over the course of what has been a tough, but I certainly think very interesting G20.
That's South Africa's Minister of Agriculture, John Steenhuisen, as we prepare to host the G20 Leaders Summit here in Johannesburg. I think you've heard from that conversation that food security isn't just a global talking point for all countries. It's a national stress test of leadership, I guess, delivery and trust. And probably the question now is whether we can turn some of the commitments that the minister has been talking about into crops and partnerships into prosperity. So that's where we're going to leave it. I'm Jeremy Maggs. You've been listening to Mandates and Megaphones, powered by Standard Bank. Minister, thank you very much indeed. I do appreciate your time.
Thank you for listening to Mandates and Megaphones. You can find more episodes on moneyweb.co.za.